Hi again. In John Stott's wonderful book, The Spirit, the Church, and the World, the Message of Acts, in the last section, Stott had been dealing with Paul in transit. And in the meantime, while Paul is traveling, Apollos visits Ephesus. This is the chapter 18 of Acts, verses 24 to 28. Meanwhile, during the year or so which must have elapsed since Paul left Corinth, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. Luke goes on to tell us the three interesting facts about him. First, he was a learned man, though logios could mean eloquent, as in the Revised Standard Version and the New English Bible, with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. Alexandria had a huge Jewish population at that time. It was here that the Septuagint had been produced some 200 years before Christ, and here that the great scholar Philo, Jesus' contemporary, lived and worked, struggling by allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament to render Hebrew religion, or to reconcile Hebrew religion with Greek philosophy. Did Apollos himself interpret the Old Testament allegorically? Perhaps Luther was right in being the first person to propose Apollos as the author of the letter to the Hebrews. Secondly, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, i.e. the Lord Jesus. He also spoke with great fervor, that is, he was fervent in spirit, as in Romans chapter 12 verse 11, probably meaning spiritually fervent, and thus matching erudition, a scholarship, with enthusiasm. In addition, he taught about Jesus accurately. He was therefore, although Jewish, a Christian teacher. Thirdly, however, he knew only the baptism of John, whom Luke knew to have been the Messiah's forerunner and to have belonged to the law and the prophets, not the kingdom. Since Apollos can hardly have known John's baptism without also knowing his teaching, he must have been familiar with John's witness to Jesus as the Messiah. But how much more did he know? At all events, when he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they recognized that his understanding was defective, invited him to their home, and explained to him the way of God more adequately, according to verse 26. Literally, more accurately, that is the Revised Standard Version. The comparative of the verb akritos, or akribos rather, used in the previous verse. It is not possible to be sure which Christian truths Apollos knew when he taught accurately, and which were explained to him more accurately. On the one hand, Luke could hardly have described him as instructed in the way of the Lord if, at that stage, he was still completely ignorant of the death and resurrection of Jesus. On the other hand, if his knowledge was largely limited to John's baptism and teaching, his grasp of these events may have been minimal, and he will also have needed to hear about Jesus' commission, exaltation, and the gift of the Spirit. Such truths as these Priscilla and Aquila taught him. Their ministry was timely and discreet. As Professor F.F. Bruce remarks, how much better it is to give such private help to a preacher whose ministry is defective than to correct or denounce him publicly. Next, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him, for he was better equipped now for a wider ministry, and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, according to verse 27, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Indeed, in 1 Corinthians 1-4, Paul himself wrote appreciatively of Apollos' ministry in Corinth, and generously acknowledged him as a fellow worker in God's field. I planted the seed, he wrote. Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So it's obvious from these verses that many Christians, and this is over 20 years since the cross, many Christians, people who were attached to Jesus in faith, nevertheless had defective views of what we would call Christology. And that goes to show that there was probably a great diversity in Christology in those first generations and ongoing. There was no uniformity of Christian doctrine in the early church. We'll put in a link to Larry Hurtado's discussion of that phenomenon, the the binitarian worship of the early church as exhibited in the epistles of Paul. Next time, Paul in Ephesus.